So my talk today begins with one of the most pretentious words I've ever used in a title, Chiaroscuro, Clouds in the California Sun, the Beach Boys' deeper vibrations. And I'll explain in just a moment what I'm about with that, but I have to first welcome us all to summer. Yesterday was the first day of summer. The day before that, Brian Wilson would have been 83, except that he died on June 11th, almost a couple of weeks ago. Excuse me, I may not have brought my right glasses, and I'll just do as well as I can with the text that I've got, the handwriting I've had.
We all have glasses that you...
Yeah, if you want to borrow mine, I can't see you.
Actually, what I'm going to do, give me just a moment. I brought my readers in, just not my bifocals, so I'll be blind to you, but able to see the text.
Well, I'm deaf.
You need
Then I'll
to
speak louder.
Well, I'm dumb.
I do have the voice to reach deaf people, though not the eyes to see a lot. All right.
Speak up, boy.
There we go. So Brian's death, June 11th, was a death of our times. Brian died in part of complications of long COVID. And given his on and off and mostly off relationship to touring, it's even possible to say, given his latter-day touring, that it was touring that killed Brian Wilson. Brian and the Beach Boys' music is best remembered for the sunshine, but his life is remembered for its clouds. Chiaroscuro needn't be an arty term for the kind of painters from the Renaissance that we name Ninja Turtles after. It can be what the clouds over Putnam County look like, especially if you're wearing polarized lenses, or over the river in my case, where I see more that way. The greatest harmony ever in popular music was found by the Beach Boys. And at the same time, the starkest contrast between that harmony and the tension and the strife of the life, particularly of Brian Wilson. These are universal themes that we think of often when we think of creative genius, right? Of the turmoil that goes into the creation of the artistic beauty. But I think not just of genius and not just of art. I think that this pairing of harmony and contrast is also a universal theme in human life, and that in some ways all of our lives are marked by that interplay and that sculpting of light and dark, if we let it be so, through our creative eye upon ourselves. Another opposition, another theme I believe we can all relate to, is the deeper vibrations of an individual contrasted with a superficial culture that, as many have said, wants us most of all not to be an individual. And so if we look at not just the light and dark opposition, but surface and depth, when I speak of the depth of the Beach Boys' vibrations, for me, that's really focused on the individual resonance of Brian Wilson, not only as a genius, someone who's way beyond the capacities of most of us in this room for any endeavor of that kind, but also just as someone who was true and real and honest to his own path, to his own selfhood, to his individuality. So in that culture, I think we can relate to that and then find that in Brian's creative arc, through all the ups and downs and trials and turmoils of life's long promised road, that just as Brian had his masterpiece that was then known for its breakdown, for his creative failure, and for a decline of decades, if he was able in 2005 to bring that together, record it, tour on it, and have it satisfactorily received, then through all that light and dark chiaroscuroed life of Brian Wilson, perhaps my unfinished masterpiece can also find its way to the world. And even apart from my masterpiece, I would say My largest lesson in today's talk is it's never too late for your smile to come out full force. Smile being the name of that project of Brian Wilson's, which was resurrected by a much older but rejuvenated Brian Wilson. I have to begin speaking of Brian's creative arc and of the Beach Boys' creative arc with the love of music. He was the oldest of three brothers, Dennis being 2 years younger, who was the drummer of the group and the only one who served and quite the ladies' man. Carl, 4 years younger, who was the lead guitarist. It occurred to me the other day, for those of you who enjoy great literature, that one can see the Wilson family as the brothers Karamazov, where Daddy Murray, who was their manager and oft abusive, is like the father in the brothers Karamazov, who ends up being slain. There's not really a Smerdyakov in this story, but Brian would be the Ivan, who's the author of The Grand Inquisitor, the sensitive, creative, intellectual one. Dennis would be Dmitri, the man of action, the headstrong, the rebel in some respects in an outward physical way. And then Carl would be the sensitive, spiritual youngest Alyosha of the family. So it really kind of works, which I'm sort of surprised there are no great books on the brothers Wilson Karamazov. In any case, it's really stirring to me to think of the dynamics of a family under those tensions, as Dennis recalled. He said, Friday nights, my father would get his paycheck. So the three of us would be in the back seat singing away. And that's actually the birth of the three brothers singing. And he adds this poignant note, which, given Father Murray's abusiveness and how the family conflict would escalate, is particularly poignant to me. He says, when we'd be singing harmony together, my father would just fall down singing with joy. Actually, I wrote singing, but that's not what the quote should have been. It should have been crying. My father would fall down crying with joy. This is the same abusive father we'll meet again later in the story. From before they were recording anything, just the sheer joy of what he was hearing in the harmonizing of his three sons. Amazing. So, Brian's first love in music was the harmonizing of a group called the Four Freshmen that was a pre-rock and roll group. They sound corny to me, but their jazz bona fides include 5 downbeat readers' votes as the best jazz vocal group at different points in the 50s. That expanded dynamic range of the Four Freshmen certainly found Brian's ear as he was mesmerized, and it shaped both his falsetto and his high voice, which didn't always need to be falsetto to get up that high. He said, it brings a feeling of love inside me, that feeling of harmony. And mesmerized was his word for it. And so that sense of the music and the harmony in the music, bringing a feeling of love, to me is the very root of what I'm trying to get at this morning in the Beach Boys around Brian Wilson. It's kind of the seed of the root of the tree of everything that became the Beach Boys out of that. Now, I can't explain that analytically, but I hear that feeling of love in the Beach Boys' harmonies. One reason they matter so, one reason many of us are lifted, is that we can still hear that in their music. So just by hearing and maybe singing along, we can feel whatever it is that love is coming from. Perhaps that's why the Beach Boys were so quickly successful. Carl asked Brian once why he thought they'd been successful, and Brian's answer was, the music celebrated the joy in life in a real, simple way. Not heavy or complex or anything, just a real, direct experience of joyfulness. The world didn't know it then, But we were waiting for the Beach Boys. The 60s that we now recall would unfold before too long, but 1962 was still the establishment 1950s. The wildest of 1950s rock and roll had been tamed. Elvis had been enlisted, Chuck Berry imprisoned, Buddy Holly deceased, and Little Richard and Jerry Lee were turning from the devil's music to seek salvation. It was time for a very white, very suburban, very teen, very bright-sounding new sound that was even adaptable from the newest fad, surfing, to the next one, of cars. So the creative wave was launched. Surfin', a self-recorded single when they only knew 3 songs, led to a major record deal with Capitol and Father Murray as their manager. And I don't share Elton John's appreciation for the harmonies of the first album, Surfin' Safari, but by the second, Surfin' USA, Brian had begun his studio mastery, producing and double-tracking all the vocals. The Surfer Girl album, which also gave us In My Room, was when, to my ears, the full-on sound of the Beach Boys' harmonies was there in its greatness. The third album, in the same surfing sequence, that's when their harmonies, for me, came all the way to life. But Brian's studio craft, along with that, had been, and would be even more inspired by Phil Spector. And that broke wide open when he heard the Spector song that first charted in the last week of August 1963. Brian was driving with his girlfriend when Be My Baby came on the radio. He immediately pulled over and declared it the best record he had ever heard. Days later, he was introduced to Spector, and they continued to have an association that for Brian became a competitive foil for his creativity. Then with another creative foil came ashore in February of '64, Beatlemania. Brian later wrote that with the coming of the Beatles, and I quote, "Suddenly I felt unhip, as if we looked like golf caddies instead of rock stars," which is true. So Fun had a more rocking sound. I don't know if that was explicitly recorded right after the Beatles, but I do know the group met right after the Beatles hit, and that Mike Love and Brian and the others were talking about having a rocking sound, and that Fun is a record they identified as having that sound, and it came out almost exactly at that point. It was in late February. And then I Get Around was their first number one, after them having some number twos and that sort of thing. And it was on an album that Brian calls a rock and roll album, All Summer Long. But even that All Summer Long was not all sunshine. Their Four Freshmen sound, they took a Four Freshmen song and actually gave it new lyrics as a tribute to Craig Breedlove, the Salt Flats racer who had been killed in an accident. So Their Hearts Were Full of Spring becomes A Young Man Is Gone. Another song on that All Summer Long album was, and one of the ones that was a great song musically, was... I got that title written down. The Warmth of the Sun. The Warmth of the Sun. They wrote that music the night, the harmonies and all. They put that together the night after JFK was shot, and then put the lyrics to what they'd written in that melancholy, deep sense of, yes, it's harmony, but the whole feel of it was constructed out of the deep, deep sadness of that moment. The next album, The Beach Boys Today, rocked on side one. One of the most underrated, fun Beach Boys songs not everybody recalls is their version of Do You Want to Dance, which was also Dennis's first lead. When my daughter was little and I could hold her like this and her legs barely reached my waist, it was one of the things on our playlist that we would dance like this to. Always a favorite of mine. Along with Dance, Dance, Dance and the other rockers on side one, the ballad side of that really anticipates Pet Sounds' brilliance. Then Summer Days slipped creatively as the record company was pressing for more sunshine. Still, California Girls' archetypal sunshine is introduced by a musical brilliance that Brian thought was the best thing he had done up to that point, that little bit of an introduction that is unrelated musically to the song, except it works. This is a good time to pause in the picture of that creative arc to look at the shadows in the picture that haven't really filled it in at this point, at least in my telling of it. Murray Wilson had for some time been abusive, and there's video of Brian listening to a recording of his father in the studio with the boys that goes like this. You guys think you're good? Can we hear a chord? Just a chord, like we used to, when you used to sing clear records, okay? Let's go. And so this is after they're wildly successful, and while he's still their manager, that is the kind of vibe in the relationship. But Brian had also changed. In December of '64, he'd had a nervous breakdown on a flight from LA to Houston as they were touring. He stopped touring to focus on writing and producing, but also on getting high as he was introduced to marijuana in 1965. And then California Girls was the first song that was recorded right after he'd taken LSD for the first time. It's possible that Brian's auditory hallucinations, which plagued him the entirety of the rest of his life, really began in 1963. But there's no question that they were worse in 1965 and 1966. This is how Brian described it. The voices say, I'm going to hurt you. I'm going to kill you. Decades later, he was diagnosed with schizoaffective disorder. And as I mentioned, the voices were with him all his life. So even his accomplishments, even the brilliance of Pet Sounds, even Good Vibrations, even his later return and relative triumph and relative sanity was still punctuated by those voices. Against that shadowed background, Pet Sounds, the album from 1966, really stands out in its brilliance. I want to focus on three anchor points in the album. What would be the fourth anchor point of Beginnings and Ends of Sides, Sloop John B., was not part of Brian's conception for the album. The record company made him put it on because they'd had a big single with it, and the record company wanted to sell product. Let me briefly also mention the music of the second song in the album, You Still Believe in Me, which is transcendent and as good a music as they ever made anywhere. It's kind of Baroque, but it's absolutely phenomenal. And I also want to briefly mention the lyric which had the title, I Just Wasn't Made for These Times, which is not quite be true to your school in terms of the spirit of it, right? In any case, the opening song of Pet Sounds, what for me sets the field ahead of it, is Wouldn't It Be Nice? A song almost all of us have heard, or if you haven't heard it or think you haven't heard of it, you probably have and just don't remember. But it's a great song of innocent young love. It's one of the most perfect expressions of the exuberance of not only falling in love, but looking ahead to all that life in love will be. And it has a line that makes me want to cry now, even though I don't always feel this way about it. And then we'll be married, and we can be happy. And I think, my God, can you imagine thinking that and feeling that? Can you imagine being so young that that's how it would seem? And then we'll be married and then we can be happy? Well, Carolyn, no. And so the album ends. It goes from the innocence to the fall. It goes to the love fallen out of your life, bottom of things, which Brian thought might have been his best song ever at the point that he did that. Even though another song is regarded by others as maybe his greatest, God Only Knows. God Only Knows can seem like a love song, and it certainly is that. But even more, I think, it's a song of confession. If you should ever leave me, though life would go on, believe me, the world could mean nothing to me. So what good would living do me? God only knows what I'd be without you. So yes, it's like, I love you so much, but more than I love you so much, it's like, what am I without you? It's more, to me, a confession of a neediness, which I look at that from a relationship point of view. If it were a friend of mine, I'd say, this is going to end bad, dude. If you're that needy for this person, you're not in a place that's ready for the love you think you need. And yet, when I look at it as a prayer, prayers of the most intense kind come from neediness. They come from unhealthy places of weakness. A prayer of entreaty is, God, I know I haven't always listened to you, but I need you to listen to me because this has got to happen. I need this in my life. Make this happen, whatever that might be. Critics of religion are, in fact, argue that the very essence of prayer is entreaty. God, please make an exception to the laws of the universe you created for my benefit here, please. And so, in the spirit of that, the almost desperate confessional quality of God Only Knows really works in relation to the God of the title, and the only knows in the more secular spirit of God Only Knows. And so, for me, that song is the real heart of the whole album. It captures something everybody, I think, can relate to in our introspective, reflective moods where we're unsure about the future, where even when we've laid the best plans we can never know how it's going to go. Pet Sounds was in part Brian's competitive relationship with the Beatles. And when he heard Rubber Soul from 1965, he's, whoa, they're really going somewhere. I'm going to go somewhere. And from that perspective, Pet Sounds was a very worthy response to that. I want to share with you some quotations from an interview I saw this is in later years, between Brian Wilson and George Martin, who was the Beatles' producer, when they were talking about the Pet Sounds album and about God Only Knows. And at one point, when George Martin is moving the sliders around on the original recording of it to bring up different channels and that kind of thing and settles it down, and then Brian says, you made a better mix of this than I did on the master. Oh my God. But George Martin's asking Brian, he says, in songwriting, how would you say that your approach to songwriting works? And this is what Brian said. He says his songs come from deep down in my soul, you know? Way deep in my soul, there's this music that wants to blow right out of my chest. And there's something he says later that I don't quite understand about how actually over different periods of his songwriting it did blow his chest. And in any case, I'll cue that up to his creative leeway in expression, but we also know that he had unconventional ways about processing information, as we'll see more of in a minute. He said, I believe that songwriting is an unconscious thing. I don't think anybody can really concentrate on music and write music. I mean, it comes from the high places of mind. And he points like this. He says, the high places of mind, and points to like a point on his head that's like kind of behind and level with his mouth. I'm sure of that, he says. Thus, after Pet Sounds, we get the Beatles' turn. Paul McCartney said Pet Sounds, and he still, I believe, says that Pet Sounds is his favorite album. And so the Beatles give us Revolver, and then it is Brian's turn. We get Good Vibrations as the first fruit of that, which is surely one of the masterpieces of 60s pop music. It is 6 months in the making in 4 recording studios. It's really overwrought, and yet it holds together in all that busyness in ways that reflect the stimuli of the period, that reflect the hip vibe, and at the same time seem grounded in that sense of the love that drives the harmonies. The problem was the Smile project that came out of that at a time when Brian was taking lots of drugs and when his mental health was at its declining point. I wanted to share with you a few incidents from that period, from late 66 to early 1967, from an essay written by someone named Jules Siegel called Goodbye Surfing, Hello God, that I found in the Penguin Book of Rock and Roll Writing on my bookshelf. One of the songs on Smiley was going to have different representatives of the 4 elements. Mrs. O'Leary's Fire was a piece he got really excited about, an experimental thing. And then after he recorded it, 2 days later, the building across the street from the recording studio burned down, and Brian perceived that there were lots of other fires, more than there should have been around LA. And so he pulled it. He actually destroyed the tapes of that, and he said, the whole thing, he says, that would have been a really bad vibration to let out on the world, that Chicago fire. He also, at that time, at a dinner party, was really shaken and got up, and someone said, what's wrong? He says, I walked in a movie today. The first thing I heard on the screen is, hello, Mr. Wilson. Then my whole life was there. They said, oh, it's just a coincidence. He said, maybe not. He said, there could be mind gangsters, couldn't there? I mean, look at Phil Spector. He could be involved in it. I heard that song 3.5 years ago, and I knew it was between him and me. And then at the studio, an acquaintance of his was turned away, and the person who was kind of the in-between was saying, I'm sorry, it's not you, it's your chick, man. Brian said she's a witch, and she's got this ESP that's completely messing with him. It's a Spectre thing. This was Brian's state of mind. That schizoaffective whatever was what was not only occluding his creative process, but in some ways worse than that, urging it on and then pulling it back and keeping him in this push-me-pull-you of creativity. I want to speed up the narrative from there to really move toward a conclusion that pulls it all in a way we can go home with. But the shorter, compressed version of what remains of that narrative, there are a couple points I want to bring up. Even as the subsequent albums declined, as they did Smiley Smile, which was whimsical and listenable and fun, they did Wild Honey, where Brian gave a more R&B sound to songs like Darlin' and the title cut Wild Honey, and then Friends, where Brian was back and produced the entire album, which is a slight but really enjoyable, pleasant album as the one before it, before he was down again and had nothing to do with 2020. So they pulled some more cuts or partial things from Smile, along with a really nice throwback, Do It Again, that people who liked the old Beach Boys liked. They put out, when Brian was better, in 1970, an album that the critics really liked. They changed labels. Brian put a lot of focus on the sound in the studio, and they released what to me was a completely unhip, square, golf caddy, matching striped shirts album called Sunflower. And it didn't sell. And so the Beach Boys got a new manager, and the new manager, Jack Riley, said, you need to lose the matching striped shirts. It's 1970, 71. And the album that they put out after that grabbed me when I was in high school and was not the quarterback of anybody's football team, as Brian Wilson had been, but I'd moved on from Grand Funk to Pink Floyd anyway, and the song we heard for meditation is from that album, Surf's Up, which culturally, Surf's Up, 1971. One of the songs on that, Mike Love, who was on board with all this, does an updated version of Lieber and Stoller's There's a Riot in Cell Block Number 9 and calls it Student Demonstration Time, memorializing Jackson State and Kent State and singing his vocals through a bullhorn. Carl Wilson, in addition to Field Flows, had another great song on that album. Brian had a couple. They pulled something out from the title song that had been on Smile. And Jack Riley, the producer, the manager, who really I hadn't thought of as a musician, wrote a song for Brian that I was very disappointed to hear it's not Brian's vocal, because I've heard it for decades and assumed it was Brian, called A Day in the Life of a Tree, using a single tree as a metaphor for ecological devastation. But it's also a song written in poignant recognition of Brian's devastation. Trees like me aren't meant to live if all this world can give is pollution and slow death. Anyway, from a listener point of view, that made me a Beach Boys fan. The depth, complexity, and hipness of that album. There was no way I was going to listen to something that sounded like it belonged to Young Americans for Freedom, conservative, whatever club, but if it engaged the world, it didn't have to be protest music. I mean, I could listen to Alice Cooper, but nobody was going to think he was an apologist for the status quo, right? What the Beach Boys did then was they combined the depth of those creative possibilities with an openness to new horizons. Kirby, you noted the electronic stuff going on in there. Brian was blown away by Walter, now Wendy Carlos's Switched On Bach. And that's what got him interested in Moog synthesizers and the like, which showed up very shortly after on that album. Anyway, the Holland album, which was 2 albums later, is also, to me, a latter-day masterpiece that blends Beach Boys harmonies with Robinson Jeffer poetry and with all kinds of great, great stuff. People don't think of that as the Beach Boys, but for me, all the Beach Boys stuff after that isn't worth listening to. So I concentrate on what Brian did. Brian fell apart. First in the 75, 76 era, but then by 1985, it was so bad that they brought this guy, Dr. Eugene Landry, back. He's the one who was the celebrity therapist who practiced 24-hour therapy, took Brian with him to Hawaii. He's the one that held him captive for 9 years and would not let him communicate with family and friends. I'm not going to go into that, except to recommend a really, really good movie. It's not Fellini good, but Love and Mercy has Paul Giamatti playing Dr. Eugene Landry. Half the movie is like a bio documentary with a young actor playing Brian Wilson very believably. The other half is John Cusack and a rom-com kind of situation, meeting up with his last wife and kind of getting out from under Paul Giamatti's Eugene Landry. So I recommend, if you're interested in that story at all, see Love and Mercy. And then there's a documentary that much of my materials come from called Long Promised Road. But the fascinating thing about the documentary is they mounted 2 cameras on a car while Brian Wilson just rode around with a Rolling Stone writer that he was really comfortable with and had been a good friend of his. And you get to just watch Brian Wilson's face and just how he talks and his one moment to the next and those kinds of things. Is quite intriguing for the intimacy of it. So the things that I want to really bring down at the end of this are: Brian was able, through all of that, to come out with listenable, good albums that suited him well, including love and mercy, that's what we need tonight. And then to bring out the Smile album and to have that succeed. And so by drawing all these things together, he individually was able to kind of die on the high ground creatively, as opposed to as somebody that is seen as having failed in his most important endeavor, perhaps. And along with that, I want to suggest that at best this morning, I hope I've given you a gift. That now sometimes when you hear the Beach Boys, you may still be uplifted, you may still have that sense of sunshine coming through the clouds in your life, but at the same time, perhaps, you'll be able to bring those harmonies and that sense in a very tangible, listenable, singable way into the rhythms of your own life. So in any case, that is my offering for you this second day of summer morning. Thank you.